Greetings, viewers. It's Matthew from Jazz Crazy Records, reporting from the Jazz Bunker, and today we have something interesting planned as we take a close look at an amazing release of outstanding digital transfers of 78 RPM records that came out last fall and is one of my favorite albums of the year. So if you need some new music in your life, stay tuned. As viewers of the channel are aware, last fall I acquired a box of African 78 RPM records from a collector in France, and in researching the artists and labels of those records and listening to them, I just went down a massive rabbit hole and learned a whole lot about a type of music I had no conception of and little understanding of. You might remember that a few of the records in that collection were from the Congolese Ngoma Label. And reading about the label and the destruction of their masters and file copies from nearly all of their music library, I got pretty interested in learning more about that label. And about that time, through a Google search, I happened upon the Planet Ilunga website, where they had just announced a new release was forthcoming that contained a massive trove of digital transfers from the Ngoma label. I promptly pre-ordered it, and it arrived, I think, in October, and quickly wore out my turntable as one of the records I listened to most often over the past few months. The music on this set is absolutely wonderful, and you've got to hear it. I was a little taken aback by how deeply it affected me musically. And what also impressed me was the beautifully designed sleeve and liner notes, which were full of information on the artists and history of the label. But this music just hit me in a new way that I didn't expect. Then there was a social and cultural history to the music that was also fascinating and compelling. I immediately thought that I wanted to share this music with you and help promote what I see as a very important body of work. But I don't know a lot about African music, so I'm excited that we have a special guest with us today who does. So today on the channel, we have a very special guest who is here to discuss this release further. Alastair Johnston is a published author, book artist, illustrator, photographer, music writer, and most germane to today's discussion, a massive fan, documentarian, and historian of African music who sometimes goes by the pseudonym Dr. Rhythm. The good doctor maintains a website called musicifan.com that reviews international music releases, which can be found online at musicifan.com. Mr. Johnston was the producer of the 3-disc set for Planet Ilunga Records in Belgium entitled Treasures of the Ngoma Label, The Soul of Congo, which documents and showcases the music of the Ngoma record label in what was then Belgian Congo from the late 40s to early 1960s. So I'm so delighted to have you with us, and I have a lot to learn from you. Welcome to the Jazz Bunker, Mr. Alastair Johnston.
Thanks, Matthew. Great to meet you.
To start out, I'm just curious about your personal journey of coming to appreciate and celebrate the music of Africa.
It's sort of an accidental or almost random thing. My younger brother, who's much more adventurous than I am, he then got a job teaching in Kenya, and he was there for about 5 years, teaching the sons of all the politicians in a very fancy, upscale school in Karen, which is that neighborhood name for Karen Blixen. And so I was determined to go see him. So I was teaching at the University of California, and I took a year off and went to Nairobi to see my brother and ended up spending 7 months in Africa. Just completely loved it, had such a great time. And one of the things I did was I went on an overland safari from Nairobi into Congo with a couple of very crazy English people who had an old army truck, and they had two things in mind. They wanted to go see the lowland gorillas, and they also wanted to visit the pygmies in Mount Ruwenzori. We never saw the gorillas, but we did spend a week with the pygmies, which are the same ones that Colin Turnbull visited the Mbuti and recorded. And so at the end of that trip, I had malaria. I was really sick, but I had developed this total passion for African music, and I got back to the US actually in time for a New Year's Eve party. And first of all, I couldn't believe how white everybody was. I mean, their skin was almost translucent. I was so used to being in Africa that it was weird that white people looked like there was something lacking in their physical makeup. And also the way they danced just freaked me out because everybody was talking heads were big and everybody was sort of dancing like this. And I thought, this is so bizarre. And so at that point, I realized something had changed in me that really loved African music and the rhythms. And I guess what you would say is I found my soul music. So from then on, 1983 on, I started listening to and collecting African music. And I was really, really passionate about Zarwa music, music of Zaire and the Congo. And that was my great, great passion. And then, expanded out from there to listen to music from other parts of Africa, discovered Hugh Tracy and his recordings, and collected as many of those as I could find. And it was a good time. Congolese music in 1983 was pretty much at the end of the golden era, but there were labels such as Original Music of John Storm Roberts, and a few others that were reissuing some great stuff from the 50s through the 70s. And so I was lucky to get in on the ground floor, as it were, and start collecting it and listening to it. I ended up DJing on a local college radio station. I used to call the DJ and bug him, and he was very nice about it. And he one day said, "Listen, instead of calling me, I'm busy queuing records. Why don't you come to my house?" So that was like a wonderful opportunity. So I became friends with Fred Hill, also known as Papa Freddy. And after a couple of years, he trained me as his sub. And then he said, look, he was more interested in jazz anyway. How would I like to take over the African music program? So I did that for 10 years. And that kept me in touch with all the new music. And then at the end of the 10 years, the college changed format, went to, pop or urban or something. I don't know, but they got rid of all the late night DJs. And so I thought, well, I should stay interested, stay abreast of the music. So I started the website in order to think about and write about the music that I loved so much. And that was about 12 years ago, I guess. And so I've been doing it ever since.
So this project, the Soul of the Congo, can you tell us just how it started? You've already kind of mentioned how you kind of ran across the music of the Ngoma label, but how did this project begin?
There are a number of people like myself, or were 12 years ago, that had websites that posted discographic information, not just reviews, but compiled serious discographies. And I got in touch. I was in touch with all of them, giving them information, getting information. And at one point, I suggested that we all get our websites on a central server, such as the British Library or Internet Archive. And I know the people at Internet Archive, and they said, sure, we'd love to do that. But nobody was interested. It's like herding cats. They all had their own ideas about their website. They didn't want other people tampering with the HTML. And now, sadly, they're all falling offline as these people die. So one of the most important websites, it's still up at the moment, is afrodisc.com. And it was run by a guy named Fleming Harev. And he spent a lot of time going to the Bibliothèque Nationale and places like that and finding old music catalogs and transcribing them, typing up every entry and putting them online. And he put together a phenomenal site of all African 78s that he could lay his hands on, and divided by country, divided by label, chronological. So it's very easy to see, very easy to access. And then about 3-4 years ago, he sent me 5 folders, 5 zip files, and said, I'm sending you these folders of music because I don't have time to listen to them. And I thought, well, that's weird. Here's a guy who loves African music, and he's telling me he doesn't have time to listen to this stuff. So I unzipped them and listened to them, and it was all really great Ngoma material that he'd got from a German researcher, a lot of it, named Wolfgang Bender. And Bender also, he did 2 CDs of Ngoma with popular African music. Bender had gone to the nephew of Kafadias, who was the owner of Ngoma, who lives in Greece, and had recorded he'd gone in his camper van for the summer, parked outside, and had recorded this guy's collection of music. And so that had from 78 and 45 to WAV files, that had gone to Fleming. Fleming had sent them to me. And I thought, that's how weird that he wouldn't have time to listen to this. What he didn't tell me was he had terminal cancer. So shortly after this, Fleming died, and I thought, that's why he sent me this stuff. He wants me to be the curator of it. So I wrote to Wolfgang, and I wrote to Gunter Gretz of Popular African Music, and I said, I want to do something with this material to celebrate Fleming's contributions, and at least keep this music, try and revive it, keep it current. And they both said, well, we'll help you, but we're not interested in publishing it. So I started contacting people like Yoshiki Fukusawa in Tokyo, who did the really great First Rumba to Real Rumba compilation from his collection of 78s. People like Mike Kiefer in Los Angeles, who does a lot of work with Mississippi Records. Jonathan Ward, who did the Opika Africa at 78 compilation. People that I knew casually, but not, I never met them personally. And Stefan Verdecker, who runs a website in Belgium. And I said, look, I want to do something with this Ngoma material to honor Fleming. And they all wrote back and said, my collection is at your disposal. And so pretty soon I had about 400 MP3s and WAV files of music to wade through. So I still have this massive folder. I started sorting through it and listening to it all. And I was just amazed at the quality of it and how great the music was. Then the next thing was to sort of narrow it down, try and get a focus. And I decided the best thing to do was to be chronological about it. And then I realized I had way too much music by Léon Bukasa, by Paul Mwanga, because they are so good. They were prolific. Their records sold well. And for some reason, they've been forgotten. And both Léon Bukasa and Paul Mwanga should have 10 CD box sets of their works out in the world, because it's so incredibly great. I mean, it really is fantastic. And I started editing it down. And at that point, Bart Katert of Planet Ilunga told me that he wanted to publish it. And so that made it very easy. From then on, I was just working with Bart, and he was advising me and suggesting things that should be included or things that should be left out. So I got it down to 4 CDs, and so about 4 hours of music. And Bart said, well, the 4th CD was all the late 60s stuff, mostly Dr. Nico and Franco and OK Jazz. And he said, that's going to be harder to license. It's going to add more expense to it. And also, maybe they should just be for a later, they are easily worth their own Ngoma compilations. So very reluctantly, because I love Nico and Franco, very reluctantly, I said, okay, we'll leave those out, but then nobody will have heard of any of these artists. He said, don't worry, that's not something to worry about. So there were a couple of songs that we couldn't find. One of them was their very first recording, Maria Tchebo, their first hit, which had been re-recorded by Adou Elenga, but the original version by Manuel de Oliveira, who wrote it, had disappeared. And so we searched and searched and finally were able to find it. And then there were a couple of other early recordings that we had that were just fried, completely thrashed, and we weren't able to salvage them. And then the next problem was, as I started to look deeper, I saw that some of the songs I really loved, like this song Canta del Negro, I loved it, but we didn't have a good copy of that. We just had an MP3, and nobody had a good copy of that. And then there were a few others that started to turn up on other compilations. There was a compilation put out in London called Congo Revolution that Vincent Lutman put together, and that was included half a dozen rare Ngoma tracks. So I just had to delete those. I had lots of other material that was possible. One of my favorites was a song by Charles Lembe called Yo Quiero Wapacha, and that had already appeared on a compilation of called Cubanismo from Honest John's records. And I thought, well, we'll have one that's already appeared. But then Sammy Ben Redjeb of Analog Africa put out this compilation called Cameroon Garage Funk, or so. It's a terrible title, and mostly terrible music too, to tell you the truth. But he included the Yo Quiero Wapacha on there as the last track. And I thought, oh, okay, that one has to go. So there was a lot of heartbreak over things that I really wanted to have in there that we couldn't put in there. But as I say, there was so much great material that we were able to include, just, solid gold for 3 hours, I think it is.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you could take us back for viewers who are unfamiliar with the Ngoma label, in your liner notes, you talk a little bit about the development of what we call the big five
Yeah.
labels of Congolese record labels. When and how did these various labels start, and in particular, the Ngoma label?
There were a couple of attempts to do recordings in Congo. The conditions were not great, no electricity, first of all, right? So to do a recording, you would take something like an acetate cutter. I guess it's like a 78 player, but instead of playing back, it actually, you sing into the horn and it cuts the lacquer right there. So you get one take to do it right. And very, very fragile process. So there was a label called CIFA, C-E-F-A, Compagnie and Enregistrement Français d'Afrique, or something is what it stands for. And they'd sent someone there who basically, I think he recorded choirs and choral groups and some folk groups, but a lot of the music was just being imported, and the music that the locals played was just played for social events. They played in bars, or they played for funerals or family get-togethers. So this Greek trader named Nico Geronimidis had opened a store in Kinshasa, which was then called Leopoldville, selling fabric, panya, the wax cloth fabric. And he also sold 78s and sort of household items. And he loved this music. And so he got himself a little acetate cutter and would go out and record 3 minutes here and there. And he was playing some of it, and some of his friends said, you really ought to start a record company, start a label. So that gave him the idea, and he threw himself into it. This would be about 1947 or 48, and started, when he went out on shopping trips or sales trips, he would go along and record musicians. And he had the idea of, if he had a studio in the back of his shop, he could bring these musicians in and record them under better circumstances, so there wouldn't be background chatter and all the rest of it, the stuff that Hugh Tracy talks about in his field recordings, when hundreds of people would show up to watch him record, and he would have to park his truck with the generator behind an anthill to deaden the noise and all this kind of stuff. So Geronimidis had the idea of putting together a house band, and he gave all of these incredible musicians like Léon Bukasa and Batubenga, Desayo, and Zila, and so on. He gave them all a stipend to come and work out, play and jam in his back shop. And then when singers wanted to come, they would decide who, they would write the arrangement. They would decide what they needed in terms of, second guitar would be good, or percussion would be good, or even, let's have a sax on here. So it was all very ad hoc, but nevertheless, he had this team of musicians who became his studio band. Then the later became the Beguen band. Sadly, he died. He was something wrong with his system, and he went back to Belgium for treatment and died in a hospital in, I think, 1949. And very, very unusual for the time. He asked to be buried in Congo. He asked for his body to be sent back to be buried in Africa because he loved Congo so much, that's a testament to, his passion for Africa. His family brought in a brother-in-law who was a banker, who had trained as a journalist and had worked in Turkey and Egypt, and they brought him in from another part of Congo. I think Stanleyville was where he was. They brought him in, and he was a businessman, and they said, would you take over and run this? So he decided that, yes, we could run this as a business. So that's what made it so successful. They got a truck, a sound truck. They toured around. They had speakers on the roof, so they would play. The musicians would go along and perform, and they used the truck as a PA, and then they would also record. And so their key musicians, who were Wendo, Léon Bukasa, and Manuel de Oliveira, they were all from very different parts of Congo and had very different musical backgrounds, but they were brought together to create this trio BOW, B-O-W. And they toured for 2 years. They toured Congo, and so they even went into Cameroon and Angola. They went all around, and the tam-tams would signal their arrival, or the lokole, the log drums would say, musicians are coming. Thousands of people would come out to greet them, and the pirogues would carry their equipment across the river to the bush, and they would set up and perform. One of them ended up with a broken leg. I mean, it sounded like an insane trip. But they collected folk songs, and they also discovered other musicians. So Cavadius, if he heard a great sax player, he would give the guy, a train ticket and say, come to Kinshasa, come to Leopoldville, we'll record you. And, some did, some refused and said, no, I'm happy here. But they found great musicians in all of the little outlying towns, particularly port towns like Matadi, where there'd been a big influx of foreign music. Sailors had brought records and so on. And so there was this sensibility, this development of a taste for Latin rhythms and European music too. So there were very accomplished musicians who could play everything, of course,
Yeah, maybe you could talk a little bit about the Cuban musical influences on Congolese music. How did the musicians of the Congo kind of adapt Cuban music, and how did they kind of make it their own?
Well, they first heard it in the 30s when white people showed up with their 78 players and would be playing, El Manicero, over and over again. I mean, as you know, if you've just started out collecting records, you only have half a dozen records, and you play them over and over and over again. I mean, some people their whole life they just have, you know, Sergeant Pepper and Bridge Over Troubled Water, and that's their record collection, you know, and that's what they play. So white people would be playing, you know, the foxtrots and so on, and the Congolese who were walking by or sitting outside would hear this, and they would recognize in the clave rhythm, they would recognize the Africanness of the music. And so this is the key thing, that it was sort of like it came home again, the Afro-Cuban sound, particularly if you listen to people like Benny Moré or Senio Rodriguez. Their music is incredibly African to begin with. They're Cuban musicians, but they were descendants of enslaved Congolese. A lot of Cuban slaves were brought from West Africa, from, you know, the Gold Coast, Benin, Dahomey, and so on. But certainly there were Congolese that were part of that mix too. And so insofar as they were able to assert a Congolese identity in Cuba, they did have these, I think they were called cabildas, that were sort of like a secret society or social club, so they could get together and have a little drum session and worship their own particular orishas or gods. And so it wasn't, you know, it was only 2 generations earlier that it had gone to Cuba. And so when it came back, it was not alien music, you know, by any means. It was something that was very, very familiar. And so the Congolese in the 30s were able to pick it out on the guitar, and the guitar had been there for a couple of hundred years. And well-known stories suggest, you know, they adapted thumb piano patterns to the finger picking style and so on. But essentially the clave is there, you know, that the 5-note staggered beat. And that's the key to the Cuban rumba, which then became the Congolese rumba, which then, you know, they took it to another level in Congo, particularly after the 70s, when longer recordings were possible. And for the first time, they could stretch out. And it wasn't just hit it and quit 3 minutes, which, you know, the Ngoma artists were great at that. I mean, they could go to the bridge within 45 seconds and be jamming for 2 minutes, you know, and then return and be out with a 3-minute song. And you're going, wow, did they just do that? You know, but then in the 70s, artists like Franco would go on stage and would play one song for an hour every night. You know, they would extend it and jam, and they would bring out different soloists and so on. And that's what people expected, just the sort of the endless flowing river of Congolese music. So it definitely comes from the groups of the 30s and 40s, and then just accelerates through time.
Yeah, so you mentioned a little bit about the kind of social context of when the Ngoma label was started. Can you talk a little more about when I listen to music, I first just like to enjoy it as music, and then I like to learn about the history and more of the social and cultural context it was created in. And I'm just kind
Yeah.
of curious, in Belgian Congo, in Leopoldville at that time, the late 40s, early 50s, what was the context in which this music was created?
Yeah, obviously this is very important. And as a fan of the music, I didn't really pay attention. And one thing I always felt was that one reason I loved African music so much was I could think and work and so on, and not have to be following the lyrics. If you're listening to, you know, a Taylor Swift or somebody singing, you know what she's singing about. You know, you're listening to the emotions in her lyrics. So in a way, to me that was an asset. But then obviously when I put this compilation together, I had to find out what these songs were about, and that was kind of mind-blowing to discover that they weren't just I love you, let's be friends, and, you know, let's get together. Yeah, yeah, yeah. They were these amazing insightful little homilies about, you know, daily life. You know, a pretty girl sleeps on a bed, but the man who sleeps on the floor will get fleas, kinds of lyrics. And, you know, going for water, and, you know, just sort of basic things like that. Some of them are incredibly some of them are incredibly political songs, like Mokili Ekobaluka, which is better known as Ata Endele, which is the refrain. And Mokili Ekobaluka says sooner or later the white man is going to have to leave. You know, we've had it. We're not going to deal with this anymore. You know, we'll drive him out, we'll kill him, whatever we have to do. He's going to leave. The artist Adou Elenga was arrested and thrown into jail, and the police raided in Ngoma studios and took away all the copies of the record. And so that was virtually impossible to find, but we did find a copy. Alan Brain, the film director who made that incredible film, The Rumba Kings, bought a copy from Clement Osunonde, who's a Congolese scholar and who's written lots of works about Congolese music. And he had managed to get one of the few known copies.
Atandele, 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 mondela kobaluka, atandele, atandele, tendele, tendele, mokili kosukwana. Okapenga na tandele, atandele, yo, yole, yole, yole.
So we were able to get that and included in the compilation. And Adou Elenga continued to be political even when he got out of jail. So that was really, really important. And another artist, Paul Mwanga, who's from Angola, who is one of my absolute favorite artists and certainly my favorite discovery from this project, also wrote lots of political songs. You know, the Portuguese have killed a black man. So you better watch out. You know, if you're Portuguese, you better watch out. And he continued to do political music, but it was in a language called Kizomba, and most of the white people in Congo who could understand Lingala did not have any idea what he was singing about. So I guess that was an asset. So what I had to do was, first of all, get all of the lyrics transcribed and then get them translated. And that required a huge network of people, some of whom I just tracked down on Facebook. I'd go to music sites. There are various Facebook groups for, you know, teach yourself Lingala, learn Lingala. And I'd find people that were friendly and willing to get involved. And I have a good friend in Nairobi, in Kenya, named Jerome Ogola, who's an author. And he also loves African music. That's how I met him, on a Franco forum online. And so I asked him to translate the Lingala songs, which he did, you know, willingly. And then the hard part was getting the Paul Mwanga songs translated, because there are not a lot of people who speak Kizomba. But I found a guy in Congo online. I never met him, but he had a friend who spoke the language. And I asked him if he could at least give me a synopsis of what the songs were about, if he couldn't transcribe the lyrics. And he said, yeah, sure. And I said, you know, I'll pay him. I'll send him a couple of $100. He's, oh, great. You know, he's getting married. That'll really be great. So the guy, they sent me the transcription. And then I went to Western Union to wire $200 to this guy in Congo. And I got a phone call from Western Union saying, do you know this guy? I said, yeah, sure. He did some work for me. They said, do you know him personally? I said, I've never met him. And they said, is this a religious donation of some kind? So Western Union were convinced that I'd been, you know, the victim of one of the famous, you know, African scammers who had talked me into sending them some money. But, you know, I was happy to do it, because those are really, really crucial lyrics to have included in the book. And then once you've got the lyrics in your hands and you're listening, suddenly it adds that whole dimension to the music. And there are half a dozen songs where I didn't bother, because even I could tell they were just, Cherie, why are you doing this to me? You know?
I had this record on repeat for the last 3 months, and only recently really dug into the liner notes. And the song you mentioned, Atandele, you know, it's a great song. You know, you listen to it, it's an enjoyable tune, but then you read the lyrics, and I'm really glad the liner notes included those, because it
Yeah.
really kind of was a whole new layer to the song. And then it unlocked all this, you know, wanting to learn more about the history that was going on at the time, and independence and things like that. So,
Yeah, it's very much like A Change Is Gonna Come, the you know, the Sam Cooke song. It's got a lot of that kind of feeling to it. And I tinkered with the lyrics a little bit, and then Bart wrote me back and he said, no. He said, I don't know what you're doing, but let's not get poetic. Let's go with the literal translation. I've got, a Lingala speaker has told me, no, it should be exactly the way we've transcribed it. And I found a couple of very useful little pamphlets that were published in Congo back in the day when people transcribed lyrics of political songs, and then they were translated into French. And I speak French, so I was able to get a lot more of the context on the political songs. And it wasn't just Adou Elenga who ended up in jail. There were several other musicians that were not on Ngoma, but on other labels that did, protest songs, and their lyrics are incredibly pointed. And of course, they're sort of allegorical, so they don't say death to Whitey Adou Elenga does, but their suggestion is, we've got to get these people to leave, their number is up. And so that was another dimension to the music that I hadn't really explored fully.
How many total? I mean, Ngoma, obviously, after the 78 era kind of ended, they went on to do 45s and LPs, but how many 78s did they end up publishing in their
I think a couple of thousand. Unfortunately, their pressing plant in Vanves outside Paris burned down, and that had a library of their master tapes and master recordings. And then they had a complete archive in Kinshasa, which they tried to give to Mobutu, and he wasn't interested. They tried to give it to the National Museum. And then finally, when they left, they just locked the door because of the troubles in the late 60s after Mobutu came to power, and they wanted, Zionization, get rid of the white people. They went back to Belgium and just left the premises, presumably with a night watchman or something checking up on it. But looters came in and trashed it, and then just dumped everything out and didn't think, oh, look, records. They just thought, white people business, let's smash this. So some of the material might have been salvaged. People might have run out with armloads of records, but the complete archive certainly didn't exist anymore. One has to assume that any records that they issued that were great, we know about because they were popular, they were reviewed, and then maybe repressed. So there were multiple copies. And certainly when they moved to France, they reissued a lot of the 78s on EP format. And those are much more accessible. You see those little red Ngoma sleeves in their four-song EPs. And those are wonderful. And those are a lot more accessible, although I imagine since my album came out, the value has gone up.
Compared to some of the other big Congolese labels, I'm trying to understand what set Ngoma apart. You mentioned a little bit about the trio, Bao and those three musicians, and I think you talked in the liner notes about how the label would just pay these musicians a monthly salary to create music. So was it the personalities on the label? Did they have a focus that was different?
They had a much wider range of music than, say, Asengo. The other labels tended to be urban labels that were recording, Leopoldville or Brazzaville musicians for their fan base. Whereas in Ngoma, because the founder, Geronimidis, was so interested in all folk music, he would go off on a trip to Cameroon and record nothing but Cameroonian folk singers for a couple of weeks. And so some of the early numbers, which have disappeared, sadly, I couldn't find any of them, but there are whole runs in the series. And again, thanks to Fleming Harev's website, I was able to identify, like there would be like 8 songs in Douala, which is a language of Cameroon. And then I would realize, oh, here are these artists. He must have gone to Cameroon and then just did a bunch of recordings right there, one shot, one take, live recordings and came back and issued them, and they were not really bestsellers. But he recorded the choir of the St. Francis of Assisi Cathedral. So that would be, Western, presumably Western Christian music. So I think Ngoma had a wider range of types of music than some of the other labels. And I tried to show a bit of that by having some there's a couple of sort of novelty acts.
So one of my favorite tracks on this set is by Léon Bukasa, the tune Monique Wa Baba.
Uh-huh.
That's the first tune that just kind of leapt out of the speakers and
That
spoke.
bass riff is so addicting, isn't it?
It just felt so fresh, timeless,
Yeah.
and part of the energy also was once that the young guitarist, Petit Django,
Yeah.
also known as Papa Noel. I think you have
Yeah, that's Papa Noel, who's still alive, but now in his 80s. Still
wow.
recording. Could be the last survivor of that entire era.
That tune is just so amazing, and the syncopated parallel vocals that come on.
Yeah.
I mean, what can you tell us about this track and maybe a little more about that guitarist, Papa Noel?
Well, he's called Papa Noel because he was born on Christmas Day. And obviously he impressed Bukasa enough that he was brought into the band. It's the same with all of these bands are like that. They would spot young talent, 15, 16-year-old kids playing a busted guitar with 3 strings on a street corner and say, come here, we'll give you a real guitar if you come and cut a record with us. So at that point, Bukasa and his band were they were all friends of his, and they were all professional musicians. So they could adapt to anything. All of his songs are very, very different, and they all really, really get a groove going it just gets you. And also, that one of the things about Ngoma that may not be that clear is that they had very, very good recording technology. It was reel to reel with 2 mics, but they knew to move the drummer behind a baffle, and for the horn player to step up to the mic when he was going to do his solo. And there's a real spontaneity to a lot of it. You knew that they rehearsed, they probably played the songs in a club for a few weeks and then said, they'd go into the studio and record 8 sides. So they would have an album's worth of material every time they went in there, because they were getting paid by the song. And they had really, really top-notch recording people.
In the liner notes, you do something very interesting. You talk about the music, you write about the music, you give a historical synopsis, but then you also include testimonials from many people who were connected in various ways to the Ngoma label, which I thought added a very human perspective to talking about the label. Can you just talk about the process of how you gathered these testimonials and why you felt these perspectives were so important to include?
Well, that was actually Bart's doing. He's done this on previous albums, and so this has sort of become part of his trademark of his label, is to give that more of a social context by having people who are not necessarily on the record but are passionately involved with the music talk about how they respond to it and what their favorite tracks are. But I was very impressed with the young African Belgian guy who is like way into this music. I mean, deeply into this music. He's a 78 collector, and it was like very refreshing to see someone of the young generation who was not white but was African, but really got it and really understood that music.
This might seem like a question with an obvious answer for anyone who loves music, but I'll ask it for the benefit of those who have not yet heard this music, what is it about the music of this label that still resonates 60, 70 years later? What is it about this music that made you want to preserve and celebrate it, and spend so much of your time, your life, kind of archiving and preserving it?
Just the sense of joy that I get from listening to it. I mean, it's the kind of music that you can dance along with, clap along with, sing along with, even if you don't know the words. Also, one of the things I have to mention is Mike Kiefer did such an amazing job of restoring the music. I don't know if you've listened to the two Ngoma CDs that came out on popular African music, but people often say, "Oh, well, I don't need to buy this because I've got a couple of Ngoma CDs already." But Gunter Gretz made a point of taking the tapes and the 78s he had and just reissuing them without doing anything to change the sound of the music. He felt that it would somehow be invading it. Whereas we had scratched records that needed to be cleaned up. But then Mike Kiefer was also able now with new technology to go in there and bring up the percussion, bring up the guitar, change the balance a bit and create a more dynamic sound. And I think that that's important because I'm sure that the Ngoma engineers would say, if you can make this more dynamic, please do. I'm not saying, like when Island Records reissued Catch a Fire by Bob Marley, they muted the bass basically, and because they didn't think the white audience could take that monster bass on the original Jamaican pressings. So we didn't do anything as drastic as that, but there was certainly a lot of sweetness and stuff, sort of buried vocals, buried guitar leads that Mike Kiefer did a great job of bringing to the fore and bringing to our attention, and that's what makes it new. I mean, it's not, he didn't recreate the music, it's still the same music, it just sounds crisp and clean, and that's what we love. It's just so joyful and so exciting, to me anyway.
Absolutely. And I'll second that. I think the record sounds amazing. I mean, I was really blown away by the quality of the digital transfers for sure.
Yeah. And I rearranged those tracks over and over again to get them. I started chronologically, but then there were times when I had 3 tracks by an artist in different parts of the record, and I decided if I put them together, you got a better sense. You got a little suite of this guy's work. And then there were places where there was too much of the same, so I had to, there were 2 great tracks, but they sounded a lot like each other, so I had to spread them out. And so there was a little bit of that going on, but it's sort of DJ fiddling, the sequencing, when you drop the needle and so on. The great opening track, the great closing track, and then everything else in between sorts itself out.
Will there be a part 2 to continue this project? And someday will there be a complete set of Ngoma releases?
Well, if somebody gets a hold of my hard drive, that's as close as they're going to get. I guess I should back it up and send it to the British Library Sound Archive. I mean, there certainly could be solo albums by Léon Bukasa now that people have discovered him, or Paul Mwanga, or Charles Lembe. If you go on Discogs, there are only 2 or 3 things by Charles Lembe. He had his first album, 1957, was on Discs Vogue in France. But he's the most sophisticated musician on there. And at first, Bart was reluctant to have him because he sounds a little too Parisian. And I thought, no, it's important to show the full range. But Lembe was a teenager when he went to Paris. His father died and he moved to Paris, and he started a band and he started a nightclub, and he was on the soundtrack of a film called Hold Up à Saint-Tropez. I've never seen it. I've never even seen a reference to it. I'd love to find it, to hear that music. But he plays guitar. He has upright piano and timbales and congas. So and I think maybe basses, electric bass as well. So it's a very unusual, it's a very Latin thing to have piano and timbales and congas. And he does the sort of wapacha is his sound, but it's wild. And finally, from listening to it over and over again, Bart also got into it and said, yeah, I'm glad we put that on there. This is really smoking. And as I say, I was sorry that my favorite of his tracks had already appeared on two other CDs. But people who get into it will go, oh, this sounds familiar. Isn't there another track by him on that? Somewhere else, or downloadable, I'm sure. So I don't think there will be a sequel. Who knows? I would love to see the complete Dr. Nico and Ngoma sides, because he did a lot of 45s for them and 3 LPs, which were reissued by Sonodisc. Franco also did, I think, 38 or something like that, singles with them. So there's certainly the possibility of albums from them. There's even a Sam Mangwana album that no one has, Les Maquisards, a very, very early Maquisard album recorded by Ngoma. And I believe I have 2 singles that were released that came off that, but I would sure love to hear the whole thing. So even I, sitting on this mountain of Ngoma, have not been able to find all of it. So it remains to be seen.
I think I just saw that Planet Ilunga is releasing a Franco set.
Yeah, the next one is going to be Edition Populaire, which was his own label after, I believe, Joseph Cabesele issued a few Franco singles. And that gave Franco the idea, I should start my own label, forget Pathé Marconi, and their 50 cents a song record deal. So he started several labels, Bowman Bango and Edition Populaire, which was, I think, mid-70s. So it's getting into the later part of Franco's career. And so some of it will be familiar, but of course, knowing Planet Ilunga, they found some gems that no one else has heard or hasn't heard for a long time.
I just want to wrap this up by just personally thanking you for all the work that you put into this set. I think it's an incredible bunch of music that has really personally inspired me and just kind of been a gateway for me into exploring the music of Africa in a much greater sense. So thank you for joining us today, and thank you
Yeah,
again for all of your work on this wonderful release.
you're very welcome. And I hope to talk to you again soon.
Suavecito, suavecito, mambo. El ritmo de azúcar.
Well, that was truly awesome. And if you found that interesting, I highly recommend that you get yourself a copy of the Treasures of the Ngoma Label, The Soul of Congo, available on the Planet Ilunga Bandcamp website, which I will put on screen and in the description below now. Please note there is a 3 LP vinyl version and a 3 CD version. The CD version includes many more tracks, and I've been told the liner notes are a little bit more extensive on the CD version. But the vinyl version includes an entire disc of records that isn't available on the CD version. So if you love this music, you're going to need both of these things in your collection. This coming week, to celebrate the Rumbas of Congo, I'll be posting digital transfers of Ngoma records from my own collection, including this wonderful Wendo record that was sent to me by one of my Instagram friends, DJ Moonshine. None of the tracks I'll be posting are included on this set, so just consider it a few more bonus tracks for you to enjoy. If you want to learn more about the history of recorded music in Africa and the rumba and jazz scene in Congo in the 1950s, I have a couple book recommendations for you. First is Rumba on the River by Gary Stewart, which is a comprehensive account of the development of Congolese music starting from the 1940s and stretching all the way into the 1990s. It's a great resource, and I'm only a few chapters in, but it's very enlightening about the social and historical contexts the music was created in. The book also has a website that has some great resources on it at rumbaontheriver.com. Secondly, for a broader account of the cultural history of recorded African music, I'm reading this book, Sweet Mother, by Wolfgang Bender. It covers many regions in Africa and many musical genres and their specific social and cultural contexts. It's got a big section on Congolese music that even gets into the evolution of dance styles within Congolese Rumba over the years. Very interesting book. So thanks for joining me today, and I hope you enjoyed learning about the Ngoma Label and the music of Congo. This channel is jazz crazy, but we agree with Duke Ellington that there are two types of music: good music and that other stuff. And today it's been a pleasure to focus on the good music of the 78 RPM era in Congo. That's all I've got for you today. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you real soon. Hi viewers, I just wanted to let everyone know all products mentioned in this video were bought on my own. I received no financial contribution in the form of payment or free product from the record labels or book publishers mentioned in this video to promote their products. This has been a public service message from the Jazz Crazy Records legal team.